This is January 30th, 2020. This is the Village of Lake Bluff Historic Preservation Commission's special meeting. We have one primary item on our agenda this evening, which is an advisory review conference relating to landmark structures at the property that I know as Stonebridge, and many of us knew as Harrison House, and many of us knew as 136 Green Bay Road. I had a number of names. But before we start on that, if you could call the roll, please.
Certainly. Member Bergman?
Here.
Member George?
Here.
Member Liebel?
Here.
Member Nickel?
Here.
Member Richardson?
Here.
Chair Kraus?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. And full attendance. The commission and all boards within the village allocate a portion of time at the beginning of every meeting for anyone who would like to address the commission on a subject that is not on tonight's agenda and is within the purview of the commission. Is there anyone who would so wish to present? Seeing none, let's move to our primary topic, which is the advisory review conference for the Stonebridge Manor House, Carriage House, and landscape features. And Glenn, if you could give us a quick summary,
Certainly.
or long summary, depending on how you're feeling.
I'll aim for a medium-length summary.
Sounds
a nice, comfortable Saturday brunch.
Good.
That's what we'll go for. So, as you're probably all here for the advisory review of the Manor House, the Carriage House, the landmarks at the Stonebridge Estate over there on Green Bay Road. Many of you probably aren't familiar with the village's historic preservation regulations, so we want to spend a little bit of time on that, not too much, and then we'll talk a little bit about the application, and then give the developer a time to present. After that, there will be some questioning of the developer, and then there will be a time for public comment. So a little bit about how historic preservation works here in the village. There are essentially three levels, if you would. The first is if you've taken no special action, if you have a building over 50 years old, which is most residences in the village for reference, if you were to seek to demolish your house, you would come to this commission. You could potentially spend up to 120 days delayed from demolishing, but at the end of that process, you could, if you wished, choose to go forward with demolition. The next level advisory review is if we've designated your property as a landmark, of which there are 23 still standing, 30 over the life of the village since this all was established in about 2004 or so, 7 which have been demolished. There's a more involved process. You can, that can be delayed a total of 150 days, but again, at the end of that process, you can elect if you are so willing to proceed with a demolition. The last level, certified landmarks, is in the village here in Lake Bluff, is when an owner chooses to subject themselves to a higher level of review. And that level, the village can say no. We can say that you are not allowed to proceed with a demolition. No property in the village has made that voluntary act. Now, I am more or less the village planner, and so in planning, we really like wayfinding. We like to tell people where they are. You are here. You are in this advisory review phase. Stonebridge is a landmark, but it's not a certified landmark, and this commission is here to conduct this review within the bounds of what it's supposed to look at. So in this advisory review process, essentially has 3 steps. The first step is there's an application that was received by the village on December 6th. The second step, which again already happened in December, is the commission meets and says, is this proposed work consistent with the purpose and goals of historic preservation in the village? And if not, it sends its recommendations, it sends its concerns, and it schedules a conference. The conference is intended to reach a mutually satisfactory resolution of those concerns, respecting that the owner and the commission both have things they want to see out of proposed work. It aims to be a collaborative process. The applicant has to attend at least once during this period of time. Again, a little bit of wayfinding. You are here. So, things that we look at, and the commission looks at in this advisory review process. The first is the commission is aiming to promote preservation, of course. It's aiming to evaluate if a proposal, this is actually the wrong slide, I apologize, but the right hand is important. Things that the HPC is not looking at as part of this process. It's not looking to regulate demolition methods or the specifics of where people park or where and how waste is hauled away, things like that. That's not within the commission's purview. The second particularly applicable here is it's not looking to regulate future development. So if this was a house in the village, the commission doesn't look at the next house to be built. In this particular case, we're not looking at any other houses to be built on the Stonebridge site. And of course, we're not looking to evaluate applications that haven't been made yet. So if the developer chooses to seek to build something else on this property, that would go to a different village committee. There would be a public process, but that's not what we're considering tonight. I should also mention sort of new discussion in these last couple of days, the development agreement. So the development agreement is between the village and the developer. That's really within the purview of the village board. Again, this commission has nothing to do with how it's enforced or what those terms are. We're just here to do the process that the code lays out that the village board has asked us to do. So with that all said, this application, in short, proposes to do a few things. All of these are landmarked on the Stonebridge property. So the first is the manor house. The application proposes to remove the manor house in its entirety. The second is the carriage house. The application proposes to remove the carriage house in its entirety. The third element is there are these protected landscape features around these houses and in the front 10 acres of the property. These plans don't propose to do anything in those front 10 acres. The gate stays, the bridge stays. Most of these elements stay. There are a few elements that are removed. So the first is behind the manor house. There's this terrace, some stone urns, planters, things of that nature. Those are all proposed to be removed and the site essentially graded to drain. The second, our original impression was that this retaining wall, which we believe is original to the property, was to be removed and again graded, essentially flat as you can get, graded to drain. We've heard from the developer since this slide was prepared that that's not the case, that they're not intending to remove this. A question to ask the developer as we go through this process. Again, here on the plans, we can see this is proposed to be removed, but if it's not, that's great. So again, our process tonight, we'll hear a presentation from the developer. We'll allow time for public comment. The commission will deliberate, and then there's one of three outcomes that can happen in any review such as this. The first is the commission can decide that this is all in keeping with preservation. It can stop its review. The second is it can continue the meeting to consider the evidence further, the things presented further, and that process again can go for 120 days, 4 months. The third is that it can request that the village board issue an additional month extension. So again, taking that process to a total of 150 days. So that was real fast, but I hope a good primer on what we're here, what we're trying to do. I'm happy to answer any questions from the commissioners before we continue forward.
Commissioners, any questions? I have an elaboration just for the audience. This advisory review conference, the intent of the advisory review conference really is to look at suggested modifications to an existing landmark. We had about a year ago, or maybe not even a year ago, one of the landmark structures in the village, the property owner wanted to make some improvements, and because it was a landmark within the village, there was an advisory review conference where we discussed the potential changes that the property owner wanted to make and came to a successful resolution on what those changes would look like to keep in character with the Historic Preservation Code and with what the commission feels is the purpose of preservation within the village. That's where the review conference works best. This is a different situation where we're looking at a landmark structure not to be modified, but to be demolished. So we have a very different set of beginning points, of precursors. We have the same process that we're following. So I hope that helps put the process a little bit more in place. So what the activities that we're going to be going through tonight, I'm going to ask the petitioner to make a presentation. I understand that there is a presentation there, and hopefully we can better understand their position in requesting this demolition to the landmarked structures. After the end of that presentation, I will ask the commissioners if they have questions of the petitioners specifically, and after that, we'll open up for public comment. And for public comment, everyone here, I hope, comes up to the dais and gives us their thoughts on what they've heard and their thoughts on the petition itself. Typically, we ask that everyone have a chance to speak before a person comes up twice. Usually that doesn't happen, but sometimes it does. That you limit yourself to 3 to 4 minutes in presentation. And if you are agreeing with what prior folks have said, it's fine to come up and say, I agree with what prior folks have said around this particular process. At the conclusion of that activity, then the commission will have some additional discussion. We may and will take questions that we have gotten from the public and ask the petitioner to respond to them. We'll probably do that in bulk after all the public comments have been made. And then the commissioners will evaluate what our next steps are. All right, so with that, I would ask the petitioner to come forward. And every time you're here, I always think we need a taller something. And again, for those of you in the audience, this is for our vast viewing audience on television and for the videotape. That's why we always try to use the speakers. If you've listened at home, it is very frustrating when you can't hear what the speakers are saying. So we try to speak into the microphone, and we'll ask all of you when you want to speak to do that as well.
I should also mention that if you have a hearing aid, if you need hearing assistance, there is a sign on the door, but we have those available if you need that.
Hello, my name is Peter Kite. I am the founder of the Roanoke Group. We acquired the Stonebridge property in 2011. I realize that we have provided you all with probably over 1,000 pages of various studies that we've gone through over the past 5 to 7 years, and I hope to try and be able to provide a brief overview of what is in that material, and then open it up to answer any questions that everyone may have. Before I start, I would like to frankly apologize to Janet Nelson. She was a former commissioner on this board, and I spent a lot of time with her and our historic consultant, Susan Benjamin, when we thought we had the ability to restore these buildings. And I feel like we've frankly kind of let her down, and I'm really never thought I would be up here talking about demolition of these buildings. And if she's watching, I'm sorry. As we go through this, our goal is obviously not to get support for or from your commission. It's not your job to support demolition of historically significant buildings. Generally, with public speaking or presentations, you're supposed to try and be happy and not let things bother you, but frankly, all the criticism I'm sure we're going to hear this evening, I probably will agree with. But what I do hope to at least be able to present is the amount of work that has gone into trying to save these buildings. So with that, I will try and kind of get into the process and answer as many questions as I can. I think the first slide is just a comparison of where we started with what we acquired in 2006. The site plan on the left is the plan that was approved in 2006. That plan involved 71 homes in the west half of the property and restoring the the manor house and the carriage house for 14 condominium units. We ended up in 2014 getting preliminary approval for 98 homes and restoring the manor house as an HOA facility. How do we get there? This is a impossible to see example of all of the various studies that we provided Mr. Cole through a Dropbox of the studies that we thought were the most relevant. I believe these are all online, so I'm not planning to go through all 1,000 pages tonight, but I would like to try and
Thank you, we all.
yeah, I would like to try and provide some guidance of why these particular exhibits were selected as we work through that, so that after this presentation, it may help people kind of go to specific documents that they may or may not be interested in seeing. I will say that this was a challenging effort in that there's probably about 1,000 pages of work in here, but there's another 1,000 pages that's not. We have legitimately spent over $1 million with various architects, studies, landscape architects, consultants on this process. That's irrelevant to you all, but we have done the work that probably should have been done before this project was approved in 2006. I look at this in kind of two phases. The first phase of this process for us was looking at the historic buildings, the manor house and the carriage house, with a residential use in place, and it morphed into an approval in 2014 of the demolition of the carriage house and the restoration of the manor house as an HOA facility. And the files back here in the Dropbox area, the ones and twos as titles for you all, and then for the public as they go through, those are really the residential use kind of components of this analysis. The most important kind of work that we did during this period was structural analysis, which I can reference if necessary, just to kind of confirm the as-built with respect to the real bones of the buildings. At that time, we were really focused on the general history of the buildings. Ultimately, when we understood the cost, we actually came to I believe it was the village board and potentially the planning commission when we understood the cost of kind of a TIF concept, which the site would qualify for, which the board at the time was not receptive to. And then ultimately, when we abandoned residential use and looked at an HOA facility, the keys to success for presentation at the time, as part of the development, were making sure that long-term sustainability was kept in mind, not just the cost to restore the buildings, but making sure that no one would be back in front of any of these commissions in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, talking about tearing them down. Part of the responsibility as a developer is making sure that you're not leaving behind issues for homeowners associations to deal with that really aren't equipped to do so. So this was just a slide pulled from the 2014 PCZBA Village Board presentations. Two of the keys to success at the time were making sure we understood what the homeowners association burden would be with this 20,000 square foot manor house as an HOA facility, and then making sure there was a proper budget in place, not just for the operating costs, but also a reserve component for those buildings, meaning, monthly HOA payments that were specifically directed towards long-term repairs, whether it be exterior stucco, windows, roof, so that there was always proper budgeting in place to keep the manor house in the right condition. Let's see. So I guess a couple of we'll just keep going to phase two. Phase two, after we got the, as I call it, the 2014 approval, the final approval in order to kind of get the reserve study and go through the process, which included HPC presentations, ABR presentations, not just for the Jensen landscape and the Manor House. Ultimately, we would have had to come to you all for the carriage house demolition, but with respect to the ABR as well, for getting the residential component, construction approaches to both the historic structures. So at the time in 2014, we thought we had a plan that worked. So we went full steam ahead across the board on everything that you have to do to go from preliminary to final approval, meaning construction drawings for the historic buildings, landscape plans to a full construction drawing set, reserve analysis for what the homeowners would be paying ultimately when they took control of the buildings. Ultimately, this morphed when we started getting really into this, into the Manor House just not making sense, which I'll get into, as a homeowners association facility, and exploring it as a event venue option, which again we'll get into shortly. So we did feasibility analysis, which is in one of those documents, on what that would look like. That included finding parking, and ultimately towards the end of this phase, just kind of an economic feasibility analysis of why this doesn't work. On the left, the main studies that I think are pertinent for anyone are the envelope restoration analysis, which I'll get into, that Jenny did, the CDs, construction drawings that were done by Northworks. I'll touch on kind of the feasibility as we go through this, but these are kind of the main kind of issues that we were going through. So we ended up with this plan, which we thought was a feasible plan, and this happened before we got final pricing back from the contractors off of a construction drawing set. We met with village mayor at the time and village attorney, village administrator, because ultimately we ended up with this conclusion that the Manor House was too much of a burden for the homeowners to maintain. The cost was trending towards a direction where it didn't make sense. So we thought that the only viable option was to turn the Manor House, ironically, back into a use that it previously, well, one of the uses that it previously was, is the Harrison's Conference Center, with an event wedding venue use. That was driven in part because AbbVie's acquisition of the Deer Path Inn, needing event space, seeing that was successful. We looked at Lake Forest Academy, that has been successful on the weekends, using their facilities for weddings, knowing kind of how much demand there was for that use. We thought, well, this could work. But in order for that to work, you would need parking. So I'm kind of flipping around here, but so we started working with Mariani on a parking plan, and this landscape plan doesn't do justice in respect to how we were trying to be considerate of the neighbors, with buffering mounds around the parking lot to try and hide it, low lighting, all that stuff. But obviously, that's a big portion of a conservation easement that does not allow pavement that we were looking at for parking options. That evolved in 2014, 2015, 2016, and then we started kind of looking at the Middle Fork development in Lake Forest that does have a development adjacent to Elwell Farms, and understanding the kind of the criticism or the frustration with some of the residents in that development with parking and use. So our feeling was to offset that the traffic and the parking, that we should explore the carriage house as an HOA facility at the time. And there was some economies of scale because we had architects, landscape architects, structural consultants, mechanical consultants, HVAC consultants. On the manor house, so we should also just use that to try and average out the cost and look at the carriage house as well. So we actually went to 100% design development drawings, which is what is truly necessary to get pricing. And what I mean by that is, and this is part of the file which is available online, so from a diligence perspective, what we ended up with from the previous developer was 9 pages. This was their plan for the manor house and the coach house. And by the way, I'm not trying to disparage the previous developer in 2006. A lot of things made sense in development that frankly just don't make sense now. So I'm sure, I'm not sure. I imagine that they would have gone through the same process that we would have gone through ultimately as part of the overall development. The difference is in their plan, the historic buildings and the conservation easement were not going to be restored until the back half, not even back half, the back 20% of the project. So in their defense, they didn't have to go to this level of planning, more than likely, as part of the approval. They would have dealt with it a few years into the development. But in any event, we had 9 pages of plans. These are not, although they're hardline, these are not schematic. And I'm trying to flip through it. There's plenty of time for you all to go through it later, but there's so much information, I don't want to take too much time. But this is the final plan set that we received from that developer at the time. And this is also in that package. This is the cost estimate, which is probably hard to see. Apologize. That we received at the time. So off of those 9 pages of plans, they estimated that this was going to be $4.46 million to restore both of the buildings, including interiors, to take it to fully finished, saleable condo units. This was backed up by a little bit more detail in terms of the various unit costs. This is all in your material. This is in the 1 section of the Dropbox. But these 10 pages and those 9 plans are what we received from that developer. Jumping ahead. When we acquired the project, we engaged with W.B. Olson, our general contractor, a lot of experience with historic restoration. They do a lot of work with Northwestern. We paid them to look at these plans and try and come up with a realistic budget. This was, after acquisition of the property. And this is in the 2.0 section of the attachments that you all received. But there, so this is the carriage house for 5 units. And their cost estimate was $3.9 million just for the carriage house, 5 units. Again, this is with no plans. This is just using their historic adaptive reuse or restoration experience. And their manor house cost estimate was $11.4 million. So let's just use dumb math. It's $15 million from an experienced contractor that deals with restoration of historic buildings versus the $4 million number that we initially received. So, we spent a fair amount of time after that looking at various residential uses. But ultimately, when we started proceeding through the entitlement process, with various kind of comments or complaints about unit count, we ultimately abandoned the residential component of the building and looked at just preserving the manor house as an HOA facility. So we assumed incorrectly that by taking out 14 kitchens, 28 bathrooms, all the uses in a residential home that are the most expensive parts of those homes, that we would be able to get a cost down to really just repair the shell of the building. And worst case scenario, at least the exterior of the manor house would look good. It would be kind of protected, and then if we couldn't get the first, second floor to work, at least we could make parts of the first floor work, and over time, if the market improved, we could figure something out that would work for the building, which really is what led us to the second phase of our analysis after the preliminary approval. Which I mentioned a second ago, so the path to the final approval. So in order to truly understand the homeowners association, HOA burden and cost and the overall development cost, we started with hiring a company called Wisjenny. Wisjenny specializes in these types of structures, and specifically, we have scientists that focus on really exterior restoration. And the first stop with us in 2015 was to get an envelope restoration approach. So independent of what's going to happen on the inside of the building, we have to make sure that the outside of the building is weather tight. And what do we have to do to get it to that level? So I'm not going to go through this I believe is a 36-page report. It's also in your files, but this goes through their analysis of these buildings, how to repair it where there's deficiencies, their recommendations for restoration. And that report was also accompanied with a 25-page plan set for contractors to go through and examine all the areas that need to be repaired in order for the building to work. So just as a reference, the 25 pages of just exterior restoration is twice the size of the complete construction drawings that we inherited from the previous developer. At the time they did this analysis, they felt the roof could be repaired. I mean, subsequent to that study in 2015, we had the polar vortex and all the phenomenal weather. And last year, our insurance company informed us they would no longer insure the roof. It has to be completely rebuilt. So the analysis and the cost of the time just assumed repairing of the roof. So that's one of the reports. Just as a second kind of reference point, the Manor House set of plans we went through with Northworks in phase 2. So we engaged, after we went through the kind of phase 1, we had an architect in Newport, Rhode Island that specialized in adaptive reuse. We were exploring the residential kind of component, got a lot of information, but felt that if we're going to go down this path, we need someone local to be here on the ground. So we engaged Northworks. We engaged a company called Skender Construction, amongst many others, to start working through the construction drawings so that we could come in front of the ABR and the HPC and present plans. And in fact, unfortunately, last time we were here, we actually thought we had an approach that would have allowed us to keep both buildings. Market was a little bit different. We still hadn't gotten cost back, but in any event, this is the end product of this approach. So again, this is a 104 pages of plans that, I'm not gonna go through all 104 pages, but just to zoom in. We had Northworks, we had a structural engineer, mechanical engineer, civil engineer, interior designer, landscape architect, and this isn't showing with Jenny because that analysis has already been done before this work went through, but there's a big difference from this level, trying to get to a good page, of plans versus what we received when we bought the property. For those of you that toured, I think you all toured, maybe, I wasn't there Monday, I was out of town, but the result of all that work was a function of all of those consultants said, we really need to know what's behind the walls of this building so we can give the right advice for how to restore it. And the other advice was the only way to protect the building is to get everything out that's been put in when it was turned into a hotel use and just to protect it so we can see where water's coming in and all that stuff. So that interior demolition permit was all driven by Northworks. It was reviewed by the city, and the main emphasis for that work was to protect the 4 rooms that had really not been touched by the hotel use. And although it's probably shocking for you all to see it, had you not been before, that was a function of, we're gonna fix this thing, and this is the best way to preserve it in the interim. And secondly, it also allows our contractors to really understand what's here so we can put plans in place to save the building. Oops. So that was really, that's what happened with phase 2. As we're pushing through all of these plans, and there's landscape plans in behind this, we're pushing landscape plans, we're pushing construction drawings for both historic buildings, we're pushing interior design, I mean everything, because we're trying to get this to a final level as soon as possible, because the market is obviously fickle and we want to get out and build. So we're pushing a lot of these plans all at the same time. And unfortunately, when we bid these plans out, and I can reference those bid sets, we actually started with a group, Skender, the group that we were working with, their initial bid, which I can pull up, it focused on kind of 3 sections. The first section was just the site work, which some of it is relevant and some of it is not because at the time they were looking at a pool for the manor house. But they did an envelope restoration analysis based off with Jenny's report, which I can highlight and I'll come back to later, that is pertinent. But ultimately, we got numbers back from them that were enormous. This was when we were looking at various restaurant uses and all this stuff. They were a union shop, so we felt, or I felt probably mistakenly, that if we found a non-union contractor, we'd be able to get the costs down. We ended up with Billy Andrews, who redid the Deer Path Inn. Very reputable. And then also another group called Veneer Construction. We sent the 106-page plan set to them for the manor house and the 65-page plan set for the carriage house to both of those groups. So we got initial numbers back, which are in that huge file. They were big. And then we came back to them and said, okay, how can we value engineer this? Just an example of one of the things they looked at. If you're trying to get on the National Register, you have to restore all of the exterior windows and you put a storm screen in front of it. You'd have to repair all the slate roof. There's only certain ways you can do the exteriors. We said, assuming without meeting with you all, that if we didn't do the National Register but we still restored, we may be able to get away with bringing in new windows, which is less expensive than trying to restore old windows. Maybe we could get a composite slate looking roof. Maybe we could sandblast the exteriors of the building versus that was Jenny passed. So they value engineered their bid estimates down, which are in your package. So what we did was, we just averaged the value engineer bids from both of those companies, for both the Manor House and the Carriage House. And we got the numbers back in 2016 for the Manor House restoration at $9 million and the Carriage House at $5 million for the average. The second line is just the cost per home. So due to the restoration, how much you have to increase the sales price of the home to cover the cost of these buildings. So in 2016, that was $96,000. And this is a formula error, so the Carriage House is wrong. But that's the cost per home line item, which I'll improve. The second thing we had done in that period of time, which I'll get into a little bit later, is we'd done reserve studies and maintenance studies with another group with actual restoration costs, landscape plans, so they could provide us with an HOA cost. And the third thing we did recently was reach back out to Bully Andrews and say, okay, you gave us bids in 2016. What is the cost difference from 2016 to today? That email is also in your package. And their kind of gross best estimate was about a 17%. Our rule of thumb is every year in Chicago, costs go up about 4% from a construction side. So taking the value engineered low estimate 2016 and applying it to today to get that Manor House in condition with $10,000 or $10 million, about $100,000 on the sales price. In this situation, the homeowners would not have to pay for a reserve maintenance cost because the operator at this time was going to be covering that as a part of the lease, which is why we started down that path, because we were trying to reduce the HOA burden. So this is just a quick HOA summary, which for this development, which is the Manor House, not necessarily that bad at $295 a month if they didn't have to deal with the Manor House. At the same time, they would have had to put up with the traffic. The Carriage House use, we had to abandon for multiple reasons, but the cost being one of them. The $6 million number, because we were exploring that as an HOA facility to try and offset the traffic issues. They would have had to cover the annual reserve maintenance as a homeowners association on top of the other HOA dues. So this just shows just the annual cost for those homeowners, the $5,000 number, between the reserve for the HOA, the master HOA, and then just the conservation easement cost for those residents. What happened during this period, I want to say it was within the last 2 to 3 years. So the conservation easement, when we met with Mayor O'Hara and Peter Friedman, we had an avenue to try and work through the conservation easement where we could carve out the parking lot area as long as we replaced it with additional acreage as conservation easement. The Supreme Court had a recent ruling that closed that option. So at that point, the parking lot that we had discussed in that location went away. So that eliminated the Carriage House opportunity. This is where we ended up from a marketing perspective, trying to find an operator. So we didn't design it, but effectively, if this building was to be used as a wedding venue, the parking lot would take place of the 3 homes that we had planned at the time, or the Carriage House, in order for an event operator to be interested in the property. That was the only event operator that responded to us based off confidentiality. I can't speak to the other 3 groups that were also interested way back when. This was the only group that came back and was still interested in the project. This is also in your package and posted online with the Wedgwood information. So we said, okay, if we're going to go this path, and this is going to be a parking lot, what do you guys need to be successful? This is their projections from an attendance perspective. So they felt that They needed to have between 190 and 275 events a year, operating this from Monday to Sunday, 7 a.m. to midnight. I think their letter of intent or their understanding is also in your package. It covers this more in depth. And that's between 18,000 and 25,000 people per year attending these events. So we knew that for getting the financials of all of this, this is another entitlement hurdle we will have to deal with. One, getting a parking lot approved adjacent to the West Terrace residence. Two, this would certainly have an increase on traffic. But this is the path that we were trying to go down to save the Manor House. This is our valuation. They were basically offering $250,000 a year as a triple net lease for the building. We made them, in our correspondence, responsible for the reserve of the buildings in the event that they left, that the homeowner association would have a building that was still intact, so they wouldn't have to deal with damages. So this is the $10.6 million restoration cost versus a $1.8 million valuation. That's our analysis. We have an economist from Gruen and Associates that did their own analysis, and afterwards, if you would like her to speak, she can. But they did a similar kind of view of the Manor House solely as a wedding event venue. And then finally, kind of coming back to the bigger picture, and probably the biggest mistake that I made in 2005, and this is regardless of use. So there's a lot of different plans in these files of things we've studied. There's some I didn't even put in. I mean, we've looked at bed and breakfast, we've looked at 4 units, we've looked at office space, all of this stuff. Even coming back to what if this home is just a single family residence? Someone doesn't mind, 71, 90 homes, whatever it is behind this estate. This is probably the most important piece of the analysis that unfortunately was probably the nail in the coffin for the Manor House, was the Wisgeny envelope analysis. And this is just their cost for making sure the building was airtight, just had power to it, had fire sprinklers, windows, stucco restoration. This is the minimum that you would have to do just to get the shell safe and dry for some long-term kind of path. At the time, that was $4.1 million. People can argue if they would like, this is more than that, or that's more than this. The subsequent bids have different numbers for all of these line items, but roughly, I'm confident in saying that no reputable contractor will come in less than where we are, whether it's between 4 or 5 million, just to get the outside of the building fixed. So what does that mean? That means that you still have 20,000, well, if you count the basement, about 28,000 square feet, as you all toured, in this scenario, that still has to be repaired at some time. So if someone wants to buy this with the eye as if I'll make this a home, that's fine. Frankly, all these plans online, if they come to us, if there's a unicorn, great. But going into it, all the plans are there to show that this is what it would cost just to get to the exterior of the building to be, airtight, weathertight, so that it could be restored. So if you apply the same kind of Bully Andrews metric of 4% per year price increase, you're at a $5 million number today. Unfortunately, as you all see as HPC members, there's articles day after day about demolition of estates everywhere, or homes that are sitting on the market. Those homes are different than this, in that the previous developer left this home with only temporary power. There's no water, no real utilities. You saw the condition, and it's been like that since 2007. We've done our best to maintain it along the guidelines that all of our consultants have recommended. But just to get the exterior done is $5 million. So the point is that whatever use you could envision, and I'm sure people have thoughts, well, it could be this and that, and you can discredit us and say we haven't studied all these options, but this is a baseline just for the outside of the building, for whatever is gonna happen on the inside. So when you see these estates that are on the market and not selling at 3 million or 4 million, that have had heat and all of electricity, whatever, and you're talking about just a remodel, this is a different animal. So we're $5 million just to get to the inside of the building. So I just wanted that to kind of put that out there, because it's important, and again, unfortunately, this is probably the biggest mistake I made. Frankly, falling in love with the buildings was ignoring, trying to figure out a way to get beyond the exterior shell restoration to find something that worked. And again, at this time, that West Jenny report did not include a new roof, which by any estimates could be $700,000 to $1 million on top of this number. So I've gone through kind of a lot. There's obviously thousands of pages left. I'm happy to answer questions, but that is really how we've gone from the 2014 plan. We have a pending submittal. I'm not sure if we're going to be in front of the Planning Commission in next month or in March, but this is our kind of last chance at a PRD approval on the right. But hopefully that is enough of an overview of how we got from A to B and from B to C with respect to the site and what we've done to try and figure out a way to keep these historic buildings. So with that, I will, I guess.
Keep that up.
Chairman Kraus,
Can you keep that?
Would you like me to sit down, or do you have
No,
questions
why don't you
first?
stay here for the commissioners when they have questions, and I actually have one.
Sure.
Just a clarification and then a couple of comments, just again for perspective. Put up the last slide you had.
Yep.
Yeah.
Even though, as Glenn indicated, we're not focused on what is proposed to be built, since you put it up here, I just want to, for the record, what you are, at this point, it's not formally been presented to the village, but at some point it may be, but you're contemplating something on the red side,
On the right side?
on the right side of the slide.
So we
So-
formally submitted, so, and in fact, we were with Mariani yesterday, so the right side of the plan involves the same philosophy that we were pursuing with the previous development plan, which is the true Jensen restoration of the landscape plan, which we hope that we are talking to you all about in the future. The main change, and we've got a lot of good information from Jensen through his various books and the consultants that we deal with, is from a historic perspective, he was big on kind of compress and release. It's hard to see, but his original players green in front of the manor house, this was a grass meadow. It's one of his signature features. He was very against traffic, and he wanted people when they got home to be able to enjoy nature both actively and passively. So the active component in his plan here was the meadow, or the players green as he had. This was designed just to be in front of the estate that was there at the time. So again, hard to see, but it was surrounded, and we have historic pictures of all the mid-story trees, the shrubs, the plants that were surrounding that manor house. The main kind of, I would call it adaptive reuse that we have proposed with our landscape plan that is currently under consideration with the Planning Commission is expanding that players green, but maintaining the same design philosophy, but not for one home, but for the homes that front that players green. That's really the only significant change.
Okay,
From the
so,
Jen's plan,
so
yeah.
I think for purposes tonight, that's adequate just for the audience.
Sure,
And as we review, to understand that what you're looking at on the right side of this two-part screen is what you're going to be proposing at some point into the village. So what the HPC is concerned about at this point is understanding exactly what that means
Demolition.
with respect to the landmarking. So let me ask you a couple of
Sure.
very specific questions, and then commissioners can do that as well. So it's our understanding that your proposal is to totally demolish the manor house.
correct,
The proposal is to totally demolish the carriage house.
correct,
The proposal is to have no change to the protected landscape, which would include the stone bridge, the pond, the entry gate, or the manor house benches.
Can we take that step by step?
Stone bridge, no
Okay,
change to the
The
bridge.
stone bridge, which I've reviewed, I think there's 4 separate hearings on the stone bridge.
I remember.
I think there was more than that.
We
I
would-
think there were two.
We would like to pursue using,
Okay, but you're not proposing
no,
demolishing
no,
the stone bridge.
no,
You-
we
You
wanna-
may have
we-
modifications.
we want to use the keystone and the existing materials, but try and get it a little bit
Okay.
closer.
The pond stays.
Correct,
The entry gate, which you had already moved, or no, the previous developer had
Correct.
moved, was part of that. And the manor house benches that are scattered.
we don't know if those are truly historic, but if they are, the plan would be, Jensen had an outlook
Yeah.
over here. The plan would be to reuse that, those benches in a different location in the
Okay,
conservation.
and a historically appropriate location.
Correct.
Okay. So we had the question Glenn mentioned earlier about the terrace walls and steps.
So
The
the-
proposal has total demolition. What are you suggesting?
We really truly haven't analyzed, there are some cool features off the back of that terrace with some spouts. We have not explored yet, trying to reuse those. I think the goal would ideally be to try and find an opportunity to reuse or find a group that could have use for that kind of fountain edge somewhere, with respect to the terrace. And you might be about to ask me, but the stone ledge,
Sure,
so that
I am.
that is actually the edge of the pool, so we have historic pictures of that. It's got steps
Right.
down into it, so the hope for us was to take that out and try and reuse it on one of the ponds, because that ledging with the thin kind of stone step down, he's used that exact same thing along a lot of pond edges, so the goal was to try and reuse that, either, probably in the front lawn would be or the front pond would be the goal.
Okay, so, and while there are still some specifics to be worked out, is it safe to say that your proposal to this group is for the demolition of the structures of the manor house and of the carriage house, the retention of, to the degree that it is historically, proved to be historically relevant and significant and existing, the
Correct.
landscape and the landscape features? Okay, what about the council ring?
So the council ring was taken apart by the previous developer. It's in the, right now, it's kind of in this area. There's a gated falling down area that's in the southern corner of the project. Our goal was to take that council ring. It's kind of depending. We have a couple different plans, but one plan indicates that it may have been in this area. One plan indicates it might have been down here, closer to the pond. Our goal was to try
Yeah,
and,
that's what my recollection is, where you've got the square,
so
that it was sort of on the southeast.
our plan
of
was
the
to try and reuse as much of that council ring as possible and incorporate it into the new PRD.
Okay, so that, I don't think is in the application that we're reviewing, I don't think, but it will be in the minutes if it is not.
Well, and that's because it's already been taken apart and it's on site.
But your commitment, if I could make that statement, to reuse the segments that you can of the council ring and restore it in what is considered to be a historically appropriate
Correct.
location on the property, okay. Okay, that's the extent of my questions. Commissioners, before we open it up to the,
Well, I have one. I understand that in your 2014 plan, there was movement afoot to have this front area along Green Bay Road with the pond and the Jens Jensen landscaping all put into a conservancy, but the final steps to getting that completed never occurred. So, am I correct on that? It is not a nature conservancy right now.
Well, it's in a conservation easement right now, correct?
Okay,
The front 10 acres is in two parcels, I believe it's A and B, and both of those are in a conservation easement.
they are,
Who own-
okay.
Who owns the easement?
We own the easement
Okay,
and the property.
all right. And theoretically, when you have a conservation easement, you transfer the easement to an easement holder, don't you?
Correct, when it has a funding mechanism, but the easement was created as a condition of approval, and that easement was to be funded by a development. That development does not exist. So we have been funding the restoration of that easement with the intention of getting a PRD approved and ultimately turning that conservation easement over. We've had many discussions about who should have that with the village. Should it be the village, the park district, whatever, but our intention is to restore it and turn it over.
Okay, so that's not a change from existing. So from the person walking by Green Bay Road, looking at the pond and the meadow, that scape, except for the manor house not being there, would not change.
That's our goal.
Other, Paul, do you have some?
The Weestiani report is 2015,
Correct.
and so you've known since 2015 the status of the exterior envelope of the building.
Correct.
How come you haven't done anything in 5 years to ameliorate any of the deficiencies there? Any of the small leaks, any of the small repairs? I mean, it seems to me that if you're planning on fixing the building up and preserving it, you would start on fixing up some of the envelope pieces.
We have it. So we've been patching the building, we've been repairing the roof. We haven't just been sitting there, and I know that's a popular Facebook kind of comment, and I guess we have not done a good enough job of detailing the work that has been done to preserve that building. But beyond kind of water damage, or, I mean, fortunately, we've only had a couple instances where presumably kids have come in and broken some windows. We've been really lucky in that. We have the site patrolled and all that stuff, but we have been, every time something comes up, we deal with it. So the main issues that we've been dealing with are roof leaks, which we've consistently fixed. We had scaffolding up there. I have to refer to Mike Walling, who is responsible for construction for us. He knows more of the detail, and I don't want to misspeak on years, but it was either last year or the year prior. We had scaffolding up to repair the roof leaks. We've had the sump pump break numerous times because inadequate power, inadequate backup. We continually fix that to keep water out of the basement. We patch all the walls we can. But this isn't a minor patch job by the nature of how big the building is. So to get approval to put, the only way to do it right is to do this. You can't get approval to do something with a plan that's not approved for a building, or we can't get approval to spend $4 million to properly keep the exterior
But
of
you
the
haven't
building.
started on any piece of that.
Excuse me?
You've had 5 years, you haven't started on any piece of that. There's no reason that you have to do $4 million or nothing.
No,
There are
no,
all sorts of pieces of this that could have been in process.
respectfully, we have. The result of the work to maintain the building and preserve it was the patching that I've discussed. The interior demolition that was reviewed and approved by the village has preserved what is there. Had we not done that work, there would be so much water damage coming through the walls on the second floor that would be coming down and impacting the 4 rooms that are historically intact. I know you don't see that, and I'm sure it's frustrating, but we have done and spent a lot of money keeping the building in the condition that it is in. We inherited this building. We didn't remove the heat, we didn't remove the utilities, that was the previous developer. We didn't cut off the back of the building, we didn't take out the boilers, we didn't do any of that work. I would say that the building is in as good of condition as it possibly could be. The fact that it's been without heat for, since 2007. And that's probably inaccurate, meaning I wasn't around here in 2007. I know that they used that building as a sales trailer. I have no idea how they heated it and cooled it. I know that when we bought it in 2011, there was nothing. There was no water, there was no electricity, there was no heating, there was no cooling. Everything was gone.
Right.
We spent, again, over $1 million. That's not just architecture costs, that's also maintenance, repairs. We've done a lot of work to keep that building in the condition it is.
When you acquired it, it still had an interior, both of the buildings still had interiors in them. And I'm amazed at the amount of interior demolition that I looked at on Monday. I'm flabbergasted that the whole second floor of that building has been completely stripped of interior. You don't need to do that to figure out what the walls are made out of. It seems to me that there's been an extraordinary amount of demolition that's gone on there. Then you go over to the carriage house, there's even more demolition that's gone on there. All demolition that seems to be in preparation of starting a new repair project or a new refurbishment project. The demolition occurs and then it stops. There isn't any work that goes beyond that. Nobody has brought in a power supply into either of those buildings, even a temporary construction power supply. No one's brought in power in off of a telephone pole and strapped a power box to the outside of the building so you could have some power in there. I'm astounded at the amount of demolition in both of those buildings.
I'm not a restoration expert. We've hired a plethora of restoration experts, and we followed their advice, and they drove the process with the village oversight. And they felt that the best way to preserve that building and also understand the true cost and the restoration methodology required to restore it was to do exactly what was done. My guess is that if you brought in an expert and looked at what was there before we took it out, and the only thing we took out was rooms that had been totally bastardized by the hotel reuse of it. There was nothing historic of significance that we walked through. In fact, when I toured the building with Susan Benjamin, our historic consultant, and I forget the gentleman's name from the state, when we walked through the entire second floor, his comment was, I don't even know if this could get on the register because the whole second floor has been totally changed from the original plans. So we hire an architect, we hire with Jenny, we hire all these historic restoration experts. We follow their advice. So if they did something wrong, I'm not qualified to comment on it. I would say that we had a lot of leaks before we did that second floor demolition. Those have gone away because we can now identify that stuff. The building is in condition where this is what you would do if you were going to rebuild the building. I understand your frustration, and I understand that it must look fairly shocking, to say the least, but
It looks like it's in the middle of a construction project. It doesn't look like you've done any work to just maintain the property, to mothball it. It looks like you've started a construction project, started demolition, getting ready to put the new interior in it. So that you start the demolition, you clean everything out, and then you stop. It seems to me that you didn't pull, you got halfway through pulling the trigger, and then you just simply decided, oh, I'm gonna change my mind.
I think that I'm not gonna give you an answer that you're gonna accept. I think that the
Fine.
best way to answer the question would be to get construction experts in the room, because I think that they would support all of the work that has been done with respect to protecting those buildings, and the buildings are as protected as they possibly could be, and in better condition from a protection standpoint than they were in 2007 when we bought it. And it looks like a construction site because we were going to construct.
Yeah.
That was the plan. So there was asbestos removal, there was lead paint removal, there was taking out all the walls that had been put in by the hotel or seminary use. I truly believe that that was all the best practice, which is what we were following with our consultants and what's in all of these reports. If if we didn't intend to restore this, let's look at us as the bad guys. It's easy for people to do, yes? We would have left everything intact, because that would have led to faster deterioration of the building. You would not have been able to see water leaks, the structural issues that were there with, I mean, there were chimneys that they had cut off half of it, that huge weight that were supported by temporary beams. There was so much that was really poorly done with that building that when we inherited it, that frankly, had we left it, I'd be surprised if the second floor was still standing. And again, I don't expect you to appreciate it, but I think that if we brought some construction experts in here, they would support the work that was done. And I don't believe groups like Northworks with Jenny, all the various consultants would ever want their name behind something if that's their business, that would jeopardize their reputation in situations like this.
Well, there's probably at least a half a dozen, if not a dozen, Howard Van Doren Shaw houses standing in, if not Lake Bluff, certainly in Lake Forest and then up and down the North Shore. And how is it that these single-family residences, all the same size, all built in the same era, all with slate roofs, stucco walls, brick walls, how is it that those buildings as private residences are still standing? The homeowners there struggle to fix up their leaks and patch up their roofs. How is it that all of those privately owned buildings seem to be in pretty good shape? The one just to the south of you, Thorndale, after being vacant for a number of years, which was kept heated the entire time, has just sold, and there's a homeowner going in there who's gonna take on the house and fix it up. We've had the same thing happen with Lansdowne here in town, another great big behemoth of a house. People have taken that on to support that and keep that up. So it seems so surprising to me to see the amount of demolition and the lack of any sort of maintenance work or any sort of preservation work on the property.
Again, I would say that if you could point me at one of those buildings that was turned from an estate into a seminary use, into a hotel, that's the difference. Those homes, they may be worn down and all that stuff, but
I can
I-
take
like-
you to one out in Gurnee.
my simple example, and I would turn to, is it Commissioner
Mm.
Richardson? My understanding is that, well, two things. One, when the hotel went under contract in 2005, that they split town. They didn't wait for the 2-year process. If that business had been viable, they would have stayed, one. Two, if it was viable, they would have put money into keeping it in good shape. I can't comment on it because I wasn't here, but
What business is that?
I can. I worked there.
I'm
So the
not,
Harrison
I'm not following the course of your statement, so.
Well, I am, and I would go back to the beginning. There's not an understanding maybe of what happened with the conference center. Harrison Conference Center, there were 13 of them in the country, and at one point, around 2001, I think it was, Hilton purchased all of the conference centers. And a couple years later, Aramark, and when Hilton owned it, it was run well. We opened to the public. I happened to be one of the people who was in front of these boards weeks on end with some of the neighbors who were not very happy about that happening as well. It opened to the public. It was a really viable business. Then Aramark bought all of the Harrison Conference Centers from Hilton. And 11 of the 13 were just managed properties. 2 of them, which was our Harrison Center, and one in New York, were actually owned, and Aramark didn't want to own the properties. So overnight, Aramark came in, the manager was fired, the new person who came in from New York wanted nothing to do with the building. They refused to keep it up, The carriage house was a mess, and they did. They closed it down quickly and shut the doors. I was there on the last day, and nothing happened. They turned everything off, walked away, and left it in a great state of disrepair, which is when, at some point, Stonebridge LLC purchased it. And I think the point that is being made is, it's not the same as the houses that are still standing, that are single-family houses. I understand that.
Well, if you own a property for 5 years, you put some money into it.
So I think that's the point, is that from 2005 to when we acquired it in 2011, no money was put into the building. And when you have a building that's not a home, it's already in jeopardy. You've cut off services, how it was designed to try and make it work for hotel rooms. And if you don't put $1 into a 20,000, 30,000, if you count the basement, into a house, like any house, for, I guess it would be, 7 years until we acquired it, you're gonna have some real issues. And that's what we're gonna
So
hear.
I think we understand the issues that we're
Sure.
talking about here. Let me put a different, same issue, different perspective, and ask you a direct question, or not direct question, but ask you, if you could explain to the commission your attempts at marketing the property. You alluded to some of the folks that you had talked to, but if you could just summarize for us your attempts at marketing.
So when we had abandoned the residential kind of use, the focus for us really kind of late 13, 14 was entitlement. And the focus and the time was really attributed, frankly, to density. So we weren't spending a lot of time answering questions about the viability of the plans that we were produced, and there was so much to deal with the density and trying to get the project approved. I believe I mentioned this earlier, frankly, we were just focused on, we need to get an HOA budget, we need to get a reserve study in place and all that stuff. We have a downside scenario where it's just the first floor. We think that'll work because we've taken out all the kitchens and the bathrooms. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not answering your question. Would you repeat?
So the efforts to market the property.
Oh,
Who-
so the market,
So how many
correct. So-
companies
so what
did
we
you
did
talk
was-
to? What were
Sure.
you looking at? What
So
are
then-
their proposals?
So we went to a hotel operator, developer, when we knew that it was going more towards that space. It was a big group. They developed the Elysian Hotel at the time, downtown. They helped us bring in contractors. We started talking about kind of restaurant, club use. We engaged this company.
Yeah, not all the details, just give us thumbnails on.
Well, we engaged a company as we were working through the plans, and this is in your packet. I'm not gonna go through it. I appreciate that. I'm trying to find it. We engaged a company called, here it is. I'm not an event operator, that's not my background. So we engaged a group that was a reputable group that deals with event space called Johnson Consultants, Cindy Little. And we had them do a feasibility analysis on event space use. Part of that process, and there's 70-plus pages in here, it's in
What's
your
the date on that? I can't read it. May or March?
May of
Just like an eye test.
16, that's a final draft. There was a first draft that I didn't include. So this is May of 16. There's
Okay, that's fine.
a previous draft that was in 15 when we really started pushing all of these options. So we engaged them to advise us, like, this isn't our business. Can you tell us if this is viable? Because the costs that we're looking at don't make sense to us. They did a 70-page analysis. They looked at Deer Path. They looked at Lake Forest Academy, all the things I mentioned. And they said, look, we think this is viable for use. Go get these plans done. Here are kind of recommendations. When you price it out, then we'll start talking about marketing. So they were working through this process. At the same time, we went to, trying to be respectful, 2 different groups, one of which locally is a third-party operator that manages one of the venues that I've referenced for event space, and the second is an operator that focuses more on golf courses and
So
with
just to cut to the chase here, why didn't those work? Why did they either not bid or
it was preliminary, because
Yeah.
we didn't have hard costs, and we didn't have entitlement options yet, because they all were talking about parking and all that stuff. So then we started saying, okay, if we're gonna market this in earnest, we've gotta have the plans, and we've gotta have the cost, and we've gotta give them all the information that they would do as part of diligence. What's my reserve study? How much parking? All that, what are the hours of use we're gonna get from the village? And that's when we started having conversations with, Mayor O'Hara. It's like, look, if this is gonna work, we need a parking lot. This in and of itself is gonna be an issue with traffic. She understood, at least in conversations, that seemed to make sense, that a parking lot would be required for this. Not guarantees, obviously, by any means, but you're gonna have to work through this process and you're gonna have to deal with it.
So it didn't work because,
Didn't work. She said,
no, not what
well, it didn't,
the village president
then
said.
we finished all the plans,
Yeah.
and then we priced it out, and that's the point where we reached back out to the groups that were previously interested. And we said, okay, if we can get this approved, would you be interested in leasing this? They said no. We had one group that came back and said, yes, we'd be interested in doing this.
And that's what you shared with us.
That was a Wedgewood analysis. We
So-
didn't put a formal brokerage package out, because again, still, that requires approval of a parking lot and all that's, yeah.
I understand. I'm trying to get a handle on how intensive your marketing activities were with respect to the Carriage House and the Manor House, specifically the Manor House, but Carriage House as well,
So their
as a
feedback,
separate freestanding entity,
Sure.
and whether that included potential purchase of the property, potential donation of the property, in effect unloading it so that you could focus on building what you wanted to build and have somebody else involved with the historic structures. So if you could help us with just
yeah, so
how hard did you try to make that work?
we've been working on it for 4 years. So there's not a lot of groups that work in this business. So we spoke to I don't want to speak where I do not know the
I don't
answer.
need names, just, so you talked to 20?
We talked to the two
40
big,
people?
we talked to the two biggest groups that do this business, that are the most appropriate kind of users. Neither of them were interested in buying. They were only interested in leasing, which is a concern. The Wedgewood group, which I'm fine using their name, they were also only interested in leasing. And they were the only viable group that we spoke with that had track record. They have over 20 facilities throughout the country
Yep,
that we found.
so that deal fell apart.
Well, it didn't fall apart. It was more, it just doesn't, the financials of it, when you have the costs compared
Okay,
to what
so
they were.
and I'm sorry for pursuing this, and I'm sorry if
No, no,
this
I'm
might
sorry if I'm
be
not
deemed to
answering
be
your
an
questions.
aggressive question, but did you ever consider getting out of that property, forfeiting the investment that you had made in the Manor House and the Carriage House, donating it, in effect, eliminating the purchase price barrier
We
so an operator, you did?
And we explored that with the condition that this has to be completed before we start selling homes. Not the day, but the restoration of this building has to be done to standards that meet this body's kind of approval, and you have to guarantee that that work will be done before we start selling homes. So let's call it an 18-month to 24-month period where the outside of the building has to look like the plans that we put together. If there are modifications that you need to make it viable, whether it be the windows or a composite slate versus real, we can get you in front of that building. We didn't pass go once that condition was thrown out there. Meaning they explored options, kicked around, but they just couldn't make sense of it. And these are people that have experience restoring these types
They
of
couldn't make
buildings.
sense, I'm sorry, they couldn't make sense of it because of the 18-month timeframe, or because of what? Because just the economics didn't work?
So I'm speaking outside of the event space use,
Right.
just anything else. It was, we'll sell it to you for $1 as long as you can guarantee that the work will be complete at the exterior up front.
Yep.
They explored it, and they could not find a use that made sense because of the way the buildings configured. It just didn't work.
Thank you. Commissioners, I want to get to the audience and,
I said, I don't think we roll long.
And by the way, just to be clear, because I can't name names, I don't know if it's relevant or not, this would be a question for Mr. Friedman, but I would sign an affidavit to any of the things I'm saying. I just can't expose
I
names,
understand confidentiality.
names
of
to,
this.
to this stuff.
So I briefly looked through all the information that came through on Monday night. There was quite a bit. But in 2011, 2012, you got the original estimate from J.B. Olson, the construction estimate.
W.B. Olson, correct? Yeah.
And, oh yeah, W. Olson. And it was 4,000 for the coach house and 11,500 for the manor home. So you kind of knew beginning, going into it, about what the costs were going to be for construction and restoration of those two buildings,
For the
right?
unit, for the plan as approved, correct?
And
That's
then, things kind of settled for a while, but then it was in 2016 when you started going into that second phase of getting information or, anyway, you got, 3 different bids, and I won't name the names.
Well,
but
no,
they
that's
were-
fine. Those groups, that's public. That's not- yeah.
Well, from Veneer,
Gander,
Vanier, or, Bullion Andrews.
Correct.
We did Deer Path and then Skender, and they were all close to the same, right?
Correct.
And also close to that same initial amount. So, I guess my question is, so then, the construction cost and the restoration costs were very similar to what you knew you were going in with. What happened then?
Okay, so it's a really good question. So first of all, although the W.B. Olson bid for the residential units was bigger, you referenced it, I pulled it up earlier, I think it's 11 something and 4
Yeah,
something. I
yeah.
hate to throw out somethings when it's this large amount of
Well,
money, but
I could,
Sure.
$3,914, 284 cents,
no, I mean, it's
11,407.50.
million,
No, yeah, millions.
yeah, so if we're gonna be
It was a little
accurate,
low.
might
I
as well,
did-
might as well be
about,
accurate.
I ballparked it.
Yeah, so 3.9 for the carriage house, and $11.4 for the manor house. So, and again, these are numbers off of a 9-page plan. Now, the difference is, they did have a higher number, as an example.
Were they apples to apples? I mean, similar? they-
Hard to say, because they were both bidding off of they were bidding off of this.
Yeah,
This is all that they had.
yeah.
Now, in fairness, fairness to Mr. Cole, he provided all the HPC information, and I believe there was a comment in one of the documents I read that we're not here to talk about interior, so there may be additional information that the ABR requested. I'm not aware of that, but from a diligence perspective, we received a sworn statement from the seller that, to his best knowledge, his cost estimates were accurate off of these plans. In fairness to him, we fell into the same trap. New home construction builders don't believe, we think we can do stuff for what new home construction costs, and unfortunately, although people will tell you differently, restoring these buildings is an entirely different animal. They did their best because they had more experience, W.B. Olson, in this space, and I believe maybe that number is close. They didn't have the benefit of the Wisjeni study. They didn't have the benefit of the 100 pages for the manor house that the previous group had. But my point is that when we got that number, our initial is not probably, it was my fault. I assumed that manor house specifically, without 9 kitchens and 18 bathrooms and all that stuff, we could do this for a lot less money. I mean, again, because those are the most expensive rooms in the building. So that's the direction that we ended up pursuing, and that was also partially forced into unit counts. So it was a mistake. Again, I wish we had done the Wisjeni analysis before 2014, because we would have come to you with real, not you, but we would have come to the planning commission and the village board with reality of this is what the exterior alone cost, and we missed that. I mean, that's just the reality. That's why we left Skender to go to different groups, and they were going to a more extreme version of restoration. There's more uses, there's an extra kitchen in there and all that stuff, but again, I truly wish I mean, we spent a lot of money pushing plans that frankly we probably shouldn't have been pushing. I mean, I think our biggest mistake, one, was not pushing that West Jenny analysis earlier, and two, in 2015, when we got that West Jenny analysis with the Skender bid, we should have stopped. But unfortunately, I was kind of in love with these buildings and trying to make it work, so I tried to push forward with plans to try and attempt to figure out something that would work. And the other thing that was happening in 2014 and 2015, which is not happening today, is the housing market actually started to look a little bit better in 2014 and 2015. So even though the costs were high, we started to see signs that starts further south and works its way up. Winnetka, Wilmette, Kenilworth, the pricing had really come up dramatically in 13, 14. Glencoe started seeing pricing come up in 14, 15. So we thought that that path was going to continue and that the market would kind of help offset some of this, and we thought that we'd be able to get some additional fee relief by providing 10 acres of park that would help offset some of these restoration costs. We had no idea, again, shame on me, thinking the cost would come in kind of the same. All that means to me is that the costs that we got from Skender and Veneer and Bully, had we given this level of plans to a residential version, that those numbers that we talked about back in 2011, they could be 2 times the bid that we received.
Okay.
Thank
Other questions?
Just a comment on, living in the town and not seeing anything that's going on back there. It's easy to think that nothing is going on back there. And looking at all of the documents that you sent, which I didn't read through every one of them, but I did open each one of them and look at them. I hadn't realized what extent of work it takes to try to pull this together. So I do appreciate the presentation and all of the knowledge and the effort that went into this. I think that all of us feel attached to those buildings, just like you say you do, and it's a really awful position to be in.
I've spoken with a lot of people who have had children married there, who've had significant events happen there, and that goes far beyond the work that we've done over 8 years. And again, I do not expect any sort of support. I'm not looking for compassion for the work that's gone in, but this is the work that is required to truly understand restoration. It is extremely significant, and that is one of the reasons why I believe we're seeing a lot of homes come down. But
I just didn't know.
nor did I, unfortunately.
Other, okay. And just my last comment, and I think it's, and I thank you for being candid with the village, with us tonight and with the village, in the fact that you made a mistake, right? The initial economic assumptions.
Multiple mistakes.
Multiple, okay. But I think that's important to get that on the record, that you're acknowledging that. We appreciate that. Unfortunately, we're at a situation now that we have to, the village as a whole will have to make some decisions. So with that, I'd like to open this up. Thank you, and stick around, please. I know you will. You're used to these long meetings.
This is the fun.
So, yeah, so what I'd like to do is invite members of the public to come up. We'll do it at the podium so that our viewing audience, which hopefully is still there, will be able to hear. Again, please direct your comments to the commission. If you want to direct them to me, that's fine, not to the petitioner. The petitioner will be taking notes as appropriate. They will have an opportunity to comment on your specifics if you wish. 4 minutes or so is what typically we allow for these kinds of comments. I know we'll all be respectful, and let's get started. So anyone, usually when one person starts, there we go, then there's a cascade.
We'll all go first.
Okay.
Good.
Good evening. My name is Rick Lesser. I live at 327 West Hawthorne Court. I'm immediately adjacent to the property. I will keep it very brief. I want to make 2 points today. The first is that unlike the bulk, the vast majority, if not all, of the applications for demolition that come before this board, this property is subject to an agreement between the village and the developer. The development agreement was entered into in 2006. It was drafted, and says on its face, by village attorney Peter Friedman. Section 1E of the agreement requires the developer to preserve the manor and gatehouse and restore the manor house to its original condition. This is not one where the property is simply owned by a homeowner who is now asking for a demolition. This is subject to the agreement. And this board, I would hope, should take into consideration the fact that the developer affirmatively agreed to maintain and restore this property. The property was then, in 2006, not significantly different than it is today, except that in the meantime, the developer demolished the furnace, the addition, and a large area, leaving the manor house in its original creation, which is what was agreed to with the village. I voted against that agreement. I was on the village board at the time. I thought the agreement was a mistake, but it was passed despite my vote as well as 2 other trustees. Now, 14 years later, I'm in the position of asking this board to enforce that agreement. This is the village's Preservation Commission, not the Demolition Commission. My second point is with regard to the easement in the front, the conservation easement. Commissioner, you asked a very good question at the beginning here, as I think any person would. Well, is that a conservation easement actually in effect? Of course it is. Yes, actually it is. It was recorded in 2006, again. It was a transfer of rights from the original owner to an organization called Stonebridge Preservation NFP. NFP stands for not-for-profit. Stonebridge Preservation NFP is an Illinois not-for-profit corporation. It is a separate entity. However, it has never actually been, no one other than the developer has ever been allowed to participate in Stonebridge Conservation NFP. I have requested in writing to join. Who would be a more normal and natural member of the organization than I would be? But, of course, my application and my request was simply ignored. Now, the developer just told you a few minutes ago that this only comes into effect, is triggered, when there is a funding mechanism. Don't take my word for it, don't take his word for it. The village obviously has the preservation easement. It is a recorded document. It says nothing whatsoever about being triggered. It does talk about funding, yes, but that's fine. There's nothing wrong with funding, but funding is not a requirement of the easement. The easement is and has been in effect for over 13 years now. The problem with the easement, and the reason that the easement is not being enforced and is not being enforced, and that preservation has not occurred, quite to the opposite, that the property has been herbicided and plastic mesh has been placed over the ground. The reason for all that is that there is no easement holder. The easement holder, Stonebridge Preservation NFP, is simply the developer. And those are my 2 points I wish to make. I would also ask my neighbor, John Grand, he's unfortunately laid up tonight, and asked me to submit, if I could, for the record, his statement, and I will just give that to Chairman Kraus, if I may.
Certainly, thank you.
Thank you.
How long, do you want to read that for the record, or?
Oh, that's okay.
It'll be in the minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another speaker?
My name is Cheryl Becker. I live at 409 Green Bay Road, just down the street from the development. And my question, which I understand so much work has gone into investigating and assessing and everything, but when I total up the years, it seems it's over 12 years of investigation and analysis. And my question is, that's how long it has taken in order to figure out what's needed? It's a question.
We'll wait. Is there anything else? I want to
That's
do
it.
all the questions
That's
in the
it,
back
just a
end, so
question.
You'll answer that after we get all the public comment. Thank you.
Hi, Tom Glusick, Lake Forest. I have a question. Mr. Kraus, you had brought up the idea of donating the house. And, I mean, I think it's a potentially great idea, but is it possible that the developer could donate the house? And I don't know what the demolition costs would have been on the servant's house or whatever in the main house, but I would imagine it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. Can the developer offer that as an incentive to somebody who could afford and has a desire to restore the house, and let him do some sort of a development that economically makes sense? You know, an example across the street, Lake Forest, across from West Park, somebody had recently purchased a very large manor home that was in disrepair and I believe sat vacant for a number of years as well. And they're totally restoring the house. And, you know, again, can the developer, would it make sense financially to donate it? And, you know, I empathize with the change of the market conditions, and it's kind of out of our control, and, you know, try to problem solve as you guys are trying to do. Thank you. And the developer seems like he's done, you know, spent a lot of time, a lot of money, looked at a lot of options, and a lot of surprises came up. And, you know, I do empathize with that to some extent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, I'm Catherine Driscoll. I live at 455 West Hawthorne Court. I first want to say thank you to Peter and his associate Mike, who were so gracious to join a whole group of neighbors at the Lake Bluff Library a couple weeks ago for a coffee and a community discussion that Rick Lesser and I and Drew Irvin put together. We really appreciate you taking the time and sharing with us your plans and having a good conversation, and also for including many of us who had the chance to go through the property on Monday, which was fantastic. So I guess my point is we're all kind of in between a rock and a hard place here. It's a difficult situation. Roanoke bought the property in a distressed state in 2011 for $8 million. They got a really good deal on 47 acres on Green Bay Road in Lake Bluff, property that had on it this incredible Howard Van Doren Shaw estate and these two structures. And when they bought the property, they knew full well, because it's according to the terms of the PRD, as Rick mentioned, they signed a contract with the village. And the village, and it's the village board, and this board, and everybody, and residents spent a lot of time compromising and trying to come up with a plan for that original development in the PRD that would be additive to Lake Bluff. And part of that, the cornerstone of that agreement was saving this Howard Van Doren Shaw estate. That was absolutely never in question, to my knowledge, in our original conversations that went on forever. So I am terribly sorry that the Roanoke Group has buyer's remorse today. I'm very sorry to hear that. We've all been there at one time or another in our lives, but they bought this property in 2011. It was expensive to restore then. It's going to be expensive to restore now. The best news of all, which I learned when I went through the property on Monday, is it is in outstanding condition. It's unbelievable. It's steel I-beams and concrete floors. And I mean, it'll be there for another 100 years unless we give them permission to tear it down. So we're, in a difficult position because they are contractually obligated. According to the terms of the PRD, they're contractually obligated to restore that manor home. If they choose, the timetable runs out here in the 120 days or 150 days or whatever that is, and they choose to move forward and tear down those structures, then the village is in a position, they're in breach of contract, the village then needs to pull that PRD, and then it's gonna resort back to its original zoning, which is 1.5 acre estate lots. Now, that is not a great solution for anybody. It's not a great solution for the developer because there's no way they're gonna be able to market and sell 47 acres of 1.5 acre lots in this current real estate market. There are 98 homes for sale in Lake Bluff right now. So that's kind of a non-starter for them. And then what does the village do? So now they just tore down this historic structure, and then we still have a defunct development that's sitting there. So I think the time is right for this commission and the village board, and let's continue to work with the developer and try to come up with some kind of creative solutions that work for them. It's not up to us to determine what should happen with that property because they own it. But it is up to us to make sure that they abide by the terms of the agreement and leave and preserve the additive property of this development, which is that historic structure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Kate Briand, 610 Lincoln Avenue. The first structure that comes to mind when I hear this, obviously, is the building that we're talking about because so many of us have interacted with it. But as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking of 1010 Green Bay Road, the Ralph Poole estate, which I'm very familiar with because I spent a great deal of my childhood in it. And it was owned by some very close friends of my parents. And it fell into a state of disrepair. It's a very important house. It's a David Adler. And people moved here, and I have some knowledge of the state that it was in and what was required to renovate it, and it was substantial. I guarantee it was 7 figures, positive. And I also am in a position to not be able to reveal why I know that, but I just do. And what I'm saying is that we're using wrong verbs. I've not heard anyone say, well, we did all this due diligence and we can't restore it. That's not what we heard. We said we just don't want to. We don't want to spend the money. So I want to make sure we're saying this correctly. This is not a building that's so far gone that demolition is the only option. That's not what we're hearing. I went on the tour on Monday and heard 6 times Mike say, this building is in great structural condition. Catherine just alluded to it. We have a contractual agreement. We have a building that's in solid structural condition. We have a building that's historically significant by one of easily the 3 most important architects in Lake Bluff and Lake Forest, David Adler, Howard Van Doren Shaw, and Stanley Anderson. I cannot believe we're sitting here having this conversation, but for time. My father was an expert in real estate for 50 years, and he would call this a wasting asset. That's what it really is. It's an asset, and it has been allowed for various reasons to continue to deteriorate. I agree with the questions. At some point you have to do it. You've done all your due diligence, then the next step is to do it. Is it expensive? Yes, but this building wasn't inherited. I don't appreciate that terminology. It was purchased knowingly, purchased in a state I assume it wasn't purchased sight unseen. Maybe it was. Caveat emptor, as Greg Brady said. All of our favorite episode of the Brady Bunch, caveat emptor. But in all seriousness, caveat emptor. Peter, you're laughing. That's funny, isn't it? It's good. You got to throw Latin in there every once in a while, otherwise it's not a fun meeting. Come on, right? Res judicata, let's get it going. But my point is this, is in all seriousness, this is our only Shaw. Right, Peter? Right, Paul? That's right. And I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but folks, if it were 60045, would we really be talking about this? We would not, because it would be in a historic district. We aren't putting muscle behind this, and we haven't, and we've refused to, and I know you all, I'm preaching to the choir. We are here for a variety of reasons. Breaching a contract, come on, Peter, let's face it, that's not really a big deal. People do it all the time. People walk away from commitments all the time. So, of course, I'm on the side of saving this building. I'm a preservationist. I believe that it's easy to tear things down. It's so easy. I looked at the packet, 295-page packet, and I saw Peter Kite tonight talked about 15 million, let's call it 20, but the demolition cost is 176,000 and change. So let's call it what it really is. It's math. That's what this is really about. It's about math. And the other math is that in place of the manor house would be 13 houses. So it comes down to that. It's emotional for me and everyone who ever worked there or went to a wedding there or whatever, right? But let's get down to, set that aside and get down to brass tacks and facts. It's about dollars and cents, but it's also about if we keep tearing down every important structure. When I was here for 512 Sunrise, I said this. Those of you that were here, Jenny, you're smiling because you know what I'm going to say. I said then, and it's true, and I'm not some prophet, I'm just saying, we were going to get to this place eventually because we are too lax in protection of these structures. And now here we are at this fork in the road. And this is about, what do we stand for crying out loud? Are we going to stand behind a contract and stand behind preservation? Or are we just going to be like, well, another one bites the dust, it will. Hey, Lake Forest, we'll come and see Shaw Buildings there. Seriously, I know, I do stand up on the side. But I'm just saying that, for real, hey, every lawyer thinks they're funny. But I mean it. The truth of the matter is it's just about math, and that's shameful. It should be so much more than that. We should stand for more than that. Because we talk about it all the time, then let's do something about it.
Thank you.
Hi, Matthew Kerouac, 314 West Hawthorne Court, so down the street. And I was here, 9 years ago, making the same statements about this project, knowing that we're going to be chasing a solution, and we're chasing a solution. We're going to end up with 2 holes in the ground and empty lots. We're going to have 3 buildings still standing there, and it's going to be another 10 years. And I do work in Evanston, and I can't change windows out in homes in historic districts. I have clients spending $80,000 to restore these wood windows. And we don't have the temerity or the guts to save a Van Joren Shaw house. It's so frustrating. I don't see where the word preservation would stay on this committee. But we're trying to preserve. And if we can't preserve this structure, you should have no more meetings, because this is the structure. And if we can't stand as a community behind this, we shouldn't stand behind anything in terms of preservation, because this is the test, and we need to pass that test. And I do feel bad. I know markets change, but the site hasn't changed since he bought it. There's no way that 98 homes are going to sell in Lake Bluff. I mean, we have so many homes on the market, so there's not a plan to make this development work. It's not going to work. It hasn't worked since 2006. Tearing down the 2 homes aren't going to make it work. It's just going to make it a site with 2 holes in it, and that's a shame for our community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katie Sakari. I live at 412 West Witchwood. I've been at a few of these meetings, and I believe in the last meeting, I spoke about one of my biggest concerns with this site. Once I heard that there was a request put in for the demolition, was that this beautiful historic home would be demolished, and the developer wouldn't be able to finish the project, and we'd be left with a big empty lot, a new developer possibly in place, and an empty set of land there with no historic value anymore. And after coming to a bunch of these meetings and kind of hearing all the details about the project and seeing all the PDFs of all the work that's gone into the research and all the stuff, I've heard about, the mistakes that were made or the miscalculations. All of that adds up to me feeling like even more so, more concerned that is what's gonna happen. And to me, all of these mistakes that were mentioned with investments and misunderstandings and all of that, to me, the biggest mistake, I'm terrified that it's gonna end up being, the biggest mistake would be that the manor house would be torn down. It hasn't been managed properly. I get it, restoration is difficult, real estate development is difficult, but maybe this isn't the correct project and this isn't the correct land. And I feel very strongly about it, that home has huge value, not only just in its historic value within the community, but within the draw that it could bring for Lake Bluff. Having homes like that differentiates Lake Bluff from other communities that are just subdivision after subdivision. Houses aren't selling around this area, and to tear something like that down, to me, is taking value out of the homes that would be built there. I just wanted to go on record because I just have many concerns about this development, having watched not much happen over the years. Thank you.
Thank you. Others wanting to speak?
Hi, I'm Dave Saflarski, 408 Malman, Lake Bluff. So I understand the property was bought for rock bottom price, 8-9 million, I believe. So I wondered if it would behoove the commissioners to perhaps go to the developers, the petitioners team to explain more of the rationale behind the costs behind his losses that is going into to renovate the facilities. So they would might shed some more light and more understanding on where he's coming from, although it seems from what he's brought to the commissioners, it's a pretty dire situation on his outlook. So I'd hate to see this obviously go, having lived in the neighborhood for most of my childhood. However, what I particularly am fond of is the tower. So, and then from what I understand, this is an all or none proposition. So he's going to demolish the coach house and the manor house. So is there any other alternatives that perhaps maybe some of it could, and I'm not saying that this is what's going to happen, but that possibly something could still stay. And what I would like to, if that's the course that's going to happen, that the tower, towers aren't built every day. You've got the two in Market Square. And one time I was in Market Square and there's people with easels. They're drawing paintings of the towers. So what a beautiful thing to leave there. And I don't know if you've done any cost of that. What would it keep that tower there? I mean, what a beautiful thing for a future development, the Howard Van Doren Shaw Tower. I mean, why can't that stay? Why does that have to go? I mean, that's going to be a sad day when that tower goes. That's like when the children's house went down with the that building. That was a beautiful building too. But I understand, the future and the progress and all that, but that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Suzanne Salzwedel. I live at 200 McLaren Lane. I don't really have anything additional to add, but I do want to give my support to all of my neighbors who have spoken. I've been involved in this process since the original PRD was put before the village board back in 2006. I spoke then. I really don't have anything more to add, but it would be a shame to go ahead and allow these historic buildings to be torn down, especially with no indication that anything positive will come of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bernadette Petty. I go to Lake Forest High School, and I would just like to say that I think that it is a terrible shame to have to lose this property. I have to see it every day when I go on the bus and I go home. I see it every day sitting there without somebody living there, and nothing's happening. And I think to lose it would be terrible for this community. And even if it was torn down, that's no guarantee that anything else will happen. You might not be able to sell the land. There's no guarantee of anything special after the demolition. I think that they should both be cared for and restored to their former glory. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Lucia Odo. I live at 315 West Hawthorne Court, and I just wanted to add my support to what the neighbors have said, and I appreciate the effort that your company has put in, but that's your business issue. And this is more important than that. I think this is preserving history, and it's a really crucial part of what Lake Bluff is. And like Matt said, what are we going to end up with? 2 big holes there while another developer struggles to sell a bunch of homes in a community that has too many for sale right now. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, would the petitioner care to respond to some of the points raised?
One, to Herb Nelson, who I hope is watching, I hope he appreciates that I've raised the microphone so that respect that everyone can hear. Two, to the HPC commissioners, and especially Chairman Kraus, I apologize that you have to face criticism that is really undue because you do not have the tools that other municipalities have with respect to historic preservation. So any anger, frankly, should be directed at myself and my company with respect to the demolition permits that we've applied to. This is not their purview to endorse demolition. I would say that Bernadette, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing names, Lucia and Katie, I agree this is a shame. I'm not, I hope that it has not come across that I'm kind of crying over spilled milk. What we've spent trying to understand these buildings, that's our business. And if we lose money, that's on us. I'm not asking for sympathy for that. We've tried to find solutions that work without kind of either a unicorn or subsidies from a municipality. Unicorn meaning some rich person that will just come spend money on this, or a municipality that's really, truly willing to get behind historic preservation. Because to do that, it requires subsidies. just to make it work. There's a lot going on. And Matt, also, I understand your frustration about the buildings being torn down. I too am frustrated. With respect to this notion that, I believe it was Katie, just do it. Well, I hate to sound sarcastic, but if you know of any lender that's interested in putting $10 million into a building worth $1.5 million, we'd love to talk to that person. But unfortunately, that doesn't exist. And that ties back to my subsidies comment, or someone that's just doing this frankly as a hobby. With respect to Rick Lesser's comments, he was on the board and he was against the project, and I wish he had had the foresight to require a feasibility analysis to be done when the project was approved. I'd be interested to have seen what that would have looked like in 2006 for the historic buildings. I wish that someone had required us to do it in 2013. We did have a comment from a few planning commissioners of make sure when you come back, you can demonstrate that this is doable. And that's the process that we went through. And again, I'll take blame on that. I should have done that before presenting a plan. It didn't happen. I'm jumping around because there's a lot of comments. So one, the initial comment of 12 years, actually 15, because this really started in, well, I would say probably 16. I would imagine the original developer went under contract in 2005. They probably started looking at this in 2003 or 4. That's a lot of time, but the true analysis that really took place was what we did between 2014 and 2016. So it was a 2-year period of a real deep dive into these buildings, and that's what's in there, and that's what's available online. And again, I wish for the village that this had been done in 2006. It wasn't. I wish that we had done it in 2011, 12. It wasn't, but we can't do anything about that now but look to find a solution that moves forward. I guess the comment on the contract is frankly correct. You know, the original developer entered into a PRD contract. We assumed that contract, and that was required to be approved by the village board, again, not your purview. And we knew that as part of that contract, if we could not develop the site the way that we thought that it was entitled, that the village board has the ability to revoke the PRD. That's the village's right. I would say that this is really kind of a three-legged stool with respect to the approval of the development. One leg was the manor house, the second was the carriage house, and the third was the Jensen conservation easement. We have an active PRD process. Although we are pursuing a demolition permit right now, our plan is to push forward with the PRD process, again, outside of your purview. We do not plan on taking any of these buildings down until we find out what the result of that PRD process is. There's a lot of things that could happen, that could come up. I think that the reason, or one of the reasons we posted so much information online is that through this PRD process, if there is the unicorn rich person or group that wants to get behind this building, all the plans are there now. And if someone wants to, in earnest, look at restoring this building, there's no stone left unturned in terms of the ability to research how they could go about doing that. So I hate to say benefit, but that is one of the, I guess, potential upsides of going through this process now is, one, it puts time pressure onto this, and two, all the information is there. So who knows what could come out of this, again, this PRD process that we intend to pursue, which, again, does involve saving that third leg at a minimum of the Jensen landscape. I guess, kind of the final thing, and again, what's been spent has been spent. That's really truly irrelevant to everyone but our capital and our investors. It's about a go forward, and how can we make the best of a tough situation. I mean, the only thing I will agree with Rick on is that maybe this shouldn't have been approved in 2006, but it was. And this isn't a raw piece of land. There's sewer in the ground, there's streets in the ground, there's a lot of infrastructure on this site. I have a biased opinion of this, but I believe that removal of a PRD is the worst possible thing that could happen to the site, because without a PRD, you're looking at zoning. Zoning does not allow for the preservation of that third leg, which is the Jensen landscape. And I hope that we are not here in 8 months talking about taking that off of the table. And I hope that something comes about this ZBA process, this planning process, that allows for something to maybe bring back the second leg of the stool. I don't know what's going to happen yet. Again, we'll either be in front of that board in February or March, and we'll probably be there for a few months as we work through this. And again, that's an opportunity for people that want to look at this project and these buildings and see if they can make a run at it. Because again, we have, I think it was, I don't have the gentleman's name that talked about the incentive for the restoration at zero cost. We've explored that, and this is an opportunity for it to be really public, and hopefully more people can see that. And again, if the village board is truly serious about historic preservation, there are plenty of tools that they can use to empower you all and to allow for the restoration of historic structures. But right now, those tools aren't being used. So I will end that. I'll try and end this with, we own this property. Whatever happens, we're going to continue to own it and do what's best by the property. We're not going to let it fall into the disrepaired state that it was in when we acquired it in 2011, where you couldn't see 2 feet into it. I appreciate that there's concern with how these buildings have been maintained, but I assure you that the experts that we use, and the list is long, have advised us on every step along the way, and we've followed their advice at every step along the way and done what's right by the property. But with that, I appreciate the time. I understand the frustration. I wish I was not here talking about demolition of these buildings, and I hope that through our active submittal that we will come back with some better answers for some of these issues. So thank you.
Thank you. And with all respect, we wish you weren't here either. We'd much rather be doing something else on a Thursday night. Do commissioners have additional questions? Please, if you'd come to the podium.
Cheryl Becker here. I have a question based on what you just said about, you mentioned the village has other options. I'm not sure exactly how you said it, for historic preservation. I mean, we're here talking about that, so I'm wondering what those are.
So back in two things. One's not going to answer your question. The second is going to answer your question. First, and I forgot to address it, I think one of the mistakes, which I've named numerous mistakes that we've made, is not bringing all this information out sooner. I mean, we were working really behind the scenes. I think that had we done that, rather than doing kind of one-on-one meetings with people and done public presentations to the entire board, this wouldn't come, the board and then the planning commission and the public process it wouldn't appear as if we were doing nothing, because that is really not the case as demonstrated when you go through all of that. But back to the tools, I mean, in 2000, I can't remember, 13 or 14, 12, 13, 14, when we started realizing how expensive the restoration truly was, we came and talked about a TIF. Based off the house pricing we were looking at, that kind of tax incentive would be something to look at. There are significant impact fees, one being the build permit fee in Lake Bluff is based off a percentage of construction cost, which is a different way of doing things. Some municipalities, instead of charging 2% construction costs for the build permit fees, outsource build permit review to a third party, and you pay $2 a foot to review a plan. It shouldn't cost more to review a $700,000 house than it does a $300,000 house. There's a money save opportunity. We're providing 10 acres of park. There's a lot of park fees that we shouldn't have to pay for as a result of that. There's all kinds of incentives that are available that would allow for historic preservation. And I hope that we explore those at the Planning Commission and really more the village board level when we come through with our plan, because that could open opportunities. And I'm sorry for the brief answer, because these were 2-hour-long, 3-hour-long presentations, multiple presentations, so it's hard to get into that now, but there are tools. Unfortunately, this board is not equipped with, they only have so much ability to make recommendations through this process. So again, this is me, and the frustration should be taken out on me. I'm not placing blame on the previous developer. We bought this property, it's on us, and hopefully we can kind of find some plan that is a good kind of outcome for the village of Lake Bluff. It's always been our desire. And I'm sorry we haven't been able to do that yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioners? Okay, let me summarize what we've done and propose a series of next steps. At our regular meeting, we had, in addition to setting up this advisory review, we had voted to extend or voted to continue the demolition delay for the 120 days over which we have our purview. So that demolition expiration would expire April 9th of 2020. So the first suggestion that I'm going to make to the commissioners is that we pass a motion tonight requesting that the village board consider the maximum extension allowed in the historic preservation ordinance, which is another 30 days. That would extend the demolition to May 9th of 2020. And the language in the ordinance suggests that extending an additional 30 days, the commission determines that efforts to preserve the landmark will promote the public welfare without causing undue hardship on the permit applicant. So I'm going to suggest, if you all agree, that we have a motion to request the village board to extend the maximum demolition delay that's possible. So that's one thing, kind of hold that in the back of your mind. The second thing I'd like to review are the advisory review criteria. There are 4 of them that we consider as we think about advisory review processes, both, as I mentioned earlier, with respect to alterations proposed to an existing landmark, not demolition, but alterations, and then also in this situation. There are 4 of them. They're fairly quick, so I'm going to read them. The first advisory review criteria: reasonable efforts should be made to use property for its originally intended purpose, or to propose a compatible use that requires minimal alteration of a structure, building site, or landscape and its environment. This application would not use any protected features since it's suggesting demolition. So that is not a reason to terminate our review. Second criteria: the distinguishing original qualities or character of a structure, building site, or landscape and its environment should not be destroyed. This application, as we know, calls for the demolition of certain protected features, and again suggests that we should continue the demolition delay. The third criteria, distinctive stylistic features or examples of skilled craftsmanship that characterize the structure, building, site, or landscape should be maintained and preserved if possible. Again, this application calls for the demolition of protected features, suggesting that the demolition delay should continue. The fourth, which is the one I want to focus on right now, demolition should not be undertaken if a structure, building, site, or landscape is economically viable in its present condition, or could be economically viable after completion of appropriate alterations, even if demolition would permit a more profitable use of such site. That's a quote from our historic preservation ordinance. So, we received an email on Monday with, I don't know how the village knows this, but Peter, it's 1,411 pages that you gave us to review on Monday for a Thursday meeting. We obviously all looked at it, I opened up every document, couldn't read them all. This time is not of existence. But I think it is critical because the conversations we've had today are really talking about the financial feasibility of adaptive reuse. So what I'm going to suggest to the commission is that we do two things. One is that we request the additional 30 days. And the second is that we continue, if we need to, if that's the right term, that the advisory review continue to our next meeting, either the next regularly scheduled meeting or the next meeting where staff will have time to review and comment and get professional support if needed in their opinion and the village board's opinion, so that we can better understand and create the record for the entire village. That's really what a committee of first impression does, is creates the record for the village board and everything that follows, so that we can better understand the economic situation that the developer has presented tonight. So I'm going to suggest those two things if the commission agrees: the extension, recommending the village board extend, and then continue this advisory review for another session, inviting the petitioner, if they would be willing, to present an economic feasibility. We didn't do the economic analysis, which I know is there and is very interesting to look at. But I think building the case and building the record, since that is one of the key components here in this discussion, would be critical.
Do you want that in two motions?
Two
or one?
motions, please.
Okay. I'll make the first motion that we request the village to extend our time frame, the extra 30 days, to May 9th.
I second.
Additional discussion? Do we need a roll call? No. Voice vote. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. And the second, I don't think we need a motion on. I think it's just an understanding of the commission that we are going to continue and invite the petitioners and certainly invite all of the audience, primarily focusing on, or at least initially focus on, economic feasibility at a meeting. We don't need a date certain because it's not a public hearing, but whenever we have the available information, our regularly scheduled meeting is second Wednesday in February, right? We will notice it appropriately. We may not have the information that we need at that point. We may do a special meeting later in the month.
Yeah, is it possible to do that kind of economic analysis? And
I don't think so. I think we'll
Bring it
have to
in
do,
three-
yeah,
in 3
we'll have to
weeks?
do a special
You know,
one.
I'd be Glenn
He's
does-
good, but
Glenn-
I don't know
Glenn's
how
but
good
he does
he
have some
really
other
is.
things to do.
I am quite honored, but yes, I do have the
It would
occasional
need
other
to be
task.
done within the demolition timeframe.
gonna
So we're
summarize all
working
that?
on April 9th, assuming the village board, that would be May 9th. And I appreciate everyone, the petitioners and everyone from the audience, giving their comments, and hopefully we'll see you at our next meeting. No, let's take just a 5-minute
Couple
room
minute break.
clearing, and we'll come back. We just have a couple of brief items.
Okay.
All, that means you. Okay, staff report?
Thank you for the recess.
February, nothing?
Sure, so brief report will get you home. So we are expecting Miss Susan Benjamin to come with her, I can't turn the mic up.
Please, if, in the back of the room, if you could go downstairs, if you want to continue, because we're still on tape. Thank you.
So Miss Susan Benjamin will be joining us in March to give her final formal presentation of the survey work that was done, in the middle at the end of last year. You've had a chance to review and work through that. I hope you will bring very good, insightful questions. I know they are bringing very good, insightful presentation.
And anything on the agenda right now for February?
Right now, nothing we foresee on the agenda for February. So, there are a couple work items hanging out there that.
So I'd
we're working to
suggest
complete.
this. I'd suggest staff take a look at the 1,411 pages and actually talk with the petitioner as well about what kind of an economic development or economic feasibility presentation they want to make and what kind of input you want to give to the commission from staff's perspective. And if that means hiring an outside consultant to do it, that will delay our review. If you guys can do it, that would make it quicker. It isn't going to happen the second week in February, but we should, once you know the time frame, let's try to get a special meeting. I don't want to do it in March because I want the Benjamin survey to take our attention, and that's going to be fairly interesting, very interesting, and take some time. So as soon as you can do that, send out a sort of a Google poll for kind of this time in February. If that's going to work. If it's going to slip to March, then it'll slip to March. But
I would say loosely, it'll take us some time to get a better estimate, but loosely I would expect, about this time in February.
That's what I had thought. So, okay, so let's.
Maybe give a week or two.
And so you could even do a Google poll or on, last week in February or something, just to have a date for people to put on the calendars.
Give us about a week. We'll get that poll out when we have a better sense of how the timing will work.
Okay.
So we don't have a date for the next meeting yet?
Our regularly scheduled meeting, the second Wednesday in February, although if there's no, February 12th, if there's no business, then we won't meet. And then the March regular meeting is the Susan Benjamin report. I can also I'll know a lot more about the history walk, which we've talked a little bit about on the back end, and hopefully we'll also have talked a little bit more about incorporating the new Benjamin findings into Choose Lake Bluff, and get an update on what little has happened there, because we've had some other things happening in the village. Okay?
Has there been any, Peter brought up a handful of economic tools, permit fees, a tax increment finance district, permit fees, inspection fees. Have they had any discussions with the village about that earlier or around us or
I'll go
before?
first on that, and then you guys, probably at the village board level. The second time we looked at amendments to the ordinance itself, and I forget how long ago that was.
This
The-
particular PRD or the PRD
Not
in
PRD,
general?
the ordinance, when we looked at amending the historic preservation
Okay.
ordinance to add districts and to add, one of the things we looked to add were financial incentives for developers. So there is, and that was rejected, it wasn't included. So there is something there that we could draw on to look at. And then when we had our Saturday meeting with the village board, there were some references to potential financial incentives, although they were way in the back, and it said we'll look at these at the back end, about how we encourage people to move into the village, which is really encouraging historic preservation individually, but there are things available that we could look at. That's my memory. You guys have others? Of what-
Yeah, so at a high level, if we take the economic analysis presented from Roanoke at its face, there's a $5 million hole to make up, which is a tremendous lift for any financial incentive I
Everybody.
could propose to you. The only thing I would think would come close is a TIF. TIF is very problematic when applied to residential areas because it creates new demand for services without accompanying revenue. The other incentives that this group has reviewed from time to time, certainly we will look at that as part of our examinations. I'm sure we would look at state incentives, things of that nature that are available. But 5 million is a very big number.
I was gonna say,
And
it seems to me to be a drop in the bucket. Any of the things that we could do as a village would contribute very little to the total amount necessary.
That would be an initial reaction, but again, we haven't looked closely at it. I can't tell you I've worked on a project at this scale.
You don't think there's $5 million in fees and?
Nope.
Nope, okay.
So,
Peter, don't we still have a contract with them?
Yeah.
So if we sue them, we can get the $5 million to renovate it.
What would we sue them for?
Well, breach of contract,
They haven't breached it yet.
not yet.
Well, they can't without us issuing a demolition permit. And they can't issue a demolition permit unless the board decides to amend the agreement.
The catch,
What's that?
the catch.
So is this called a rock and a hard place?
it's called the development of Iraq or something. To the degree that we are going to talk about financial incentives that could be considered both in this instance and as part of the revised historic preservation ordinance, I would prefer that come from staff and not from the developer. So I would prefer the staff to give us alternatives rather than the developer to initiate that conversation. They can comment if they want, but that comes from us. Any, commissioners, any other? Thanks for your attendance, and, look at that. 9:40. Sure, if you go over there, sorry.
No, not at all. Glenn, I just had a hard time hearing you. You mentioned a number 5 million, but I don't know what it was in reference to.
Certainly. So if you look among the 1,400 some odd pages presented by the developer, and there's a report completed by Gruen and Associates that attempts, again, we haven't evaluated how accurate it is, but it attempts to estimate the value of the current entitlements, and essentially it asserts that because of the, let's say, excessive costs of renovating the manor home, that the current value of the plan as entitled is in the neighborhood of negative $5 million. Phrased differently, to entice a developer to construct it, you would have to offer them a $5 million cash subsidy in the land for free. And there are different assumptions that go into that statement. Most notably, like a 20% internal rate of return and so on. I don't mean to say that we've evaluated those closely, only to say that if you take what has been presented on its face, that is a very substantial amount of money for any incentive to overcome.
And essentially, that's what we've asked them to help us with, that the commission has asked staff to help understand the 1,400
And that was my
pages,
next question was.
and ask them to
segue.
present the economic analysis
Okay,
to
so
us.
your reason for your interest in the economic viability of this is that downstroke, basically, that $5 million?
It's understanding, it's building a public record and having public conversation and input on that gap, the financial gap.
Got it. I just wanted to understand that number better. Thank you.
So do we. Anything else? Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Anybody? We are adjourned at
9:40.
That's correct. Thank you.